With every new form of art or communication comes a new form of horror. The only concept that has matched the mutating landscape of the internet is the very anxiety that it induces. The internet is a man-made universe, which means that the horrors and inhibitions of humanity fester and grow exponentially. The view of a fluorescent screen like a flashlight turned away from a colony of damp mold, only catching scant glimpses of the cloying mass. I desire a greater understanding of this horror and the means to express it, so my aim with this video essay is to analyze different pieces of horror media on YouTube. I will look at 3 different channels dealing with 3 distinct varieties of fear, all representing different epochs of the site. First will be PiroPito, aka Nana825763. Japanese artist that has been composing nightmarish videos since the beginning of YouTube and continues to upload to this day. Next up, The Little Fears, particularly effective creepypasta narrator that has had a significant impact upon myself and some other creators, though her presence during the early 2010s was short-lived. Finally, there's Petscop, a relatively recent phenomenon in the realm of internet horror that has inspired many imitators prior to and post its enigmatic conclusion. Alongside a straightforward dissection of a few videos for each respective creator, I want to use a particular interpretive lens in order to better understand what makes them effective in disturbing us. One of the leading contemporary philosophers on aesthetics is Noël Carroll, wrote a book entitled The Philosophy of Horror, or Paradoxes of the Heart, which largely analyzed horror films in order to compose a novel and robust taxonomy of the genre. He coins the term art horror as a means to differentiate scary media from actual traumatic events or phobias, thus ruling out the vulgar terror of visceral documentaries or shock sites. Following this, he goes on to describe the 2 major trends in the design of monsters, fusion and fission. Fusion might refer to something like a zombie fusing together dead tissue with the remnants of a human mind. Fission, on the other hand, might be a werewolf divided in time by the thin blade of temporality. What makes such things scary, according to Carroll, is not that they particularly resemble any true threat in the real world, nor due to some involuntary empathy towards the suffering protagonist, but because our minds can recreate and tweak a single minute of film thousands of times over. There is also a section regarding the narrative structure of horror, which will not be relevant for the vignette nature of my first 2 subjects, but I will touch on it when I reach the final topic. In the meantime, I shall utilize his theoretical frameworks as a means to more confidently ascertain the organs of these terrible behemoths. The channel Nana825763 has been up and running since September 2006, while the website YouTube only began in February 2005. It's therefore apt that this creator's most successful work is a frightful deconstruction of the site itself, exposing it as a barely concealed portal to Sheol through the video username 666. The imagery is still, no doubt, disturbing, while the outdated layout of the site ultimately contributes to the feeling of something abandoned and forgotten. One gets a similar feeling perusing old GeoCities pages through the Internet Archive, passing crumbling structures in an abandoned cityscape. There are many similar appeals to urban exploration, sans the potential risks, though this video suggests that this bubble of assumed safety might be an illusion. Like any good Lovecraftian expedition, the intrepid explorer is confronted by horrors far beyond the bounds of their own hubris. The seemingly innocuous ritual of reloading a page becomes an exponentially corrupting influence within one specific location, till the Internet Explorer window resembles the angry red flesh of an undying cadaver. The video implies that YouTube suspended the page of username 666 because of the disturbing content within its videos, which involves eclectic and jerky movements of myriad macabre imagery. It never explicitly violates the TOS. It must then be the case that there is another hidden quality to these videos that makes them worth concealing, while also rendering them impossible to fully remove. Just as the background depicts flesh amalgamating into a single entity, so do the functions of the user's PC, fusing together in order to keep them from escaping. The established bounds of HTML and Java finally collapse when a hand reaches out from the video interface and seems to break even the bounds of the fourth wall within fiction. This is neither the first nor last video to utilize YouTube as a medium for terror. One need only look at Alan tutorial to see an entirely separate execution of the same basic concept. But the visuals have certainly influenced what people think of when they hear the word creepypasta. It is unmistakable that PiroPito utilizes the idiosyncrasies of both Japanese culture and Japanese art horror to stylize the creepy imagery that might otherwise feel drab to the horror aficionado. Moreover, there seems to be a great deal of overlap between the work and the characteristic elements of the Silent Hill series, seemingly taking cues from the hybrid of animation styles and live-action photos utilized by Masahiro Ito, as well as the tortured and industrial soundscapes of Akira Yamaoka. This is no surprise, considering that Silent Hill shares with PiroPito's work an apparent obsession in how the mind can combine the ordinary and surreal to something unspeakable. There are two motifs that run throughout their videos that bear out this purpose: the fusion in old and new, and the fusion of innocence and corruption. The video Wakagoke Sepponsu is a good example of how PiroPito subverts the temporal divide between modern and archaic, both through form and content. Images are composed of wooden prints that slide open and shut like traditional Japanese paper doors, while particular objects move and shift like shadow puppets. At the same time, the way these images transition and morph suggests digital manipulation, whereas windows open and close like computer pop-ups, thus suggesting an animated desktop. Considering what the video depicts, there is traditional imagery of flowers, butterflies, and fish representing femininity, juxtaposed with risque silhouettes, light bulbs, and outlets, and modern military soldiers. The audio, too, conveys esoteric spiritual chanting and bells alongside alternating feminine gasps of pleasure and pain. The overall effect is a moving diorama of voyeurism, engaging the viewer in a ritual of taboo and exploitation until the program crashes on a final silhouette with an eyeless expression of disapproval. Poco Poco Picotan, video animated in stop motion, represents an innocent and cute simulacra transforming into an exhibition of destruction and death. Two little girls, one with a crown and the other with pigtails, dance around in a pastel-colored set with a number of animal friends. The characters are drawn in colored pencil with exaggerated and simple heads and eyes in order to appear cute and match the style of children's media more broadly. Gradually, the video briefly switches over to a crimson filter, where black hands press and paw at anything in reach to infect it with rot. Two girls seem rather oblivious to the decay until they themselves become distorted, then running away in vain to avoid their fates. The girl with pigtails is beheaded and left to run around blindly, while the princess must watch helplessly while the rest of her world is stabbed, stomped upon, and burned. It seems that the video not only suggests the inevitable corruption of the innocent, but the cruelty and sadism of those that partake in their suffering. PiroPito's content is thought-provoking and gut-wrenching in its presentation, rivaling the creations of David Lynch for pure visceral effect. If you are at all interested in creating this kind of horror, I highly advise you to study the videos on this channel and the techniques that their creator helpfully lays out in follow-ups. The artist is able to create provocative visuals on par with any expensive digital monster, utilizing a relatively small budget and a massive amount of dedication. If you're simply looking to be scared, which is valid in its own right, I recommend searching out My House Walkthrough, one of the most genuinely disturbing pieces of art I've ever watched, and don't want to spoil for fellow nightmare enthusiasts. Whereas PiroPito deals with the horrors of nightmares and hallucinations, The Little Beers partakes in horror that truly embodies its name. Minimalist horror is not the fear of something small, or even the fear of pure minimalism per se, but fear that has been reduced to its most bare essentials. The Little Fears has a relatively short-lived career before its narrator went to work on other projects, namely forming the noise pop band Black Dresses. But videos that still persist on the channel largely follow the same formula: sparse narration of a creepypasta with little to no editing, either one or a handful of still shots related in some way to the story involved, and a general tone of something mundane and inexplicable. None of these short films surpass 8 minutes in length, generally settling around 2 to 3, because there is no need for anything more extravagant. Unlike other creepypasta narrators, The Little Fears does not concoct an elaborate persona for herself, like describing herself with a quote, "A nice Canadian lady with a soothing voice." There's no framing device, every story is self-contained, and she never drops character to plug her social media. Altogether, this sort of setup embodies the most fundamental idea of what creepypasta is and should be. They can come from anyone or anywhere. They give you all the details you need to come to your own conclusions. You never get a satisfying answer to the many questions you no doubt have. In order to explicate this, I will play these few videos in their entirety, interspersed with my own thoughts and commentary.
I've always been a bit of a curious person. Over the last few weeks, I've noticed that some of my clothing stored in my dresser has been a little disarranged, to say the least. I'm fairly organized, so the mystery of how my things ended up in a less than pristine state had been gnawing at the back of my mind. Now, mind you, the changes have all been quite innocent in nature. I like to organize things by size, and a few articles of clothing would end up crumpled or in the wrong order. It reared itself as a topic of conversation a few times, each ending with the same conclusion. I should videotape my dresser while I was out of the house. Having assumed my sister to be the culprit, the goal was to catch her in the act. I placed the video camera within a box so as to conceal my motives and went about my day, allowing the camera to film until it ran out of tape. Now, you're going to have to trust me on this, but you don't want to see what comes next.
An excellent exhibition of minimalist horror. There is nothing you can reasonably excise from this video without ridding it of its central point. A cynic might decry this video as an excuse for an easy visual effect at the end that's not any better than a jump scare. That is not the point. What makes the video work as an eerie piece of media is the build-up to the scare, which ultimately does not pay off, as the footage pauses before anything definitive is revealed. Were some terrible ghoul to suddenly pop out of the drawer, that would be totally incongruous with the tone of the video and the curiosity it's meant to evoke.
Every year around Christmas, 2 or 3 snow globes seem to surface from the brown cardboard boxes in the basement and perch themselves around the house like little glass birds. This one is my favorite. It's not particularly old or special. I just like that it has a little wind-up box built in. I always found the mechanism fascinating. When I was younger, I'd wind it up over and over again, putting it to my ear and listening to all the gears turning inside of it. That's how I noticed a small peculiarity in its function. After the music box bends its last note, I could sometimes hear a little whine come from within it, distinct from the toiling of the cogwheels. I tried to record it here in this video. Did you hear it?
Arguably, this video could be described as more minimalistic than the last. Not just in the sense that it is a few seconds shorter, but because the visual is nothing more than an ordinary snow globe. It also ends with a brief scare that comes after some build-up, but there is an essential difference here. In the last video, the narrator's response is appropriate for something unnerving, but this one ends with the narrator asking, "Did you hear it?" in dissonant serenity. This causes the audience to question themselves for a second and wonder if that really was the sound they were supposed to hear.
In December 2001, a website supposedly founded by a Catholic school teacher from British Columbia started getting a lot of attention on a couple of paranormal-themed message boards. The website claimed that a number of young children, mainly kindergarten and first grade students from a small Victoria area school, had begun acting strangely during class. Apparently, as many as 15 students all started exhibiting emotionally unstable and volatile behavior within the span of a month. In 2 extreme cases, the author of the website mentioned students repeatedly and spontaneously urinating or defecating during lessons, having never shown signs of such behavior before. According to the earliest posts on the website, when concerned teachers tried to console the distressed students or understand their dramatic shift in behavior, a striking trend emerged. Again and again, young students claimed to be followed by stick men. Almost all of the children who made this claim struggled to further explain the nature of these stick men, but one boy offered the insight that they were sticks that had lots more little sticks for arms. In an uncertain attempt to try and discern the nature of this unusual issue, or perhaps to sate their own curiosity, the teachers asked a few of the troubled students to draw their imaginary tormentors. But the result only puzzled them further. The anonymous author of the website claimed that he posted photographs of these illustrations in the hopes of finding some link between the common fears of his students. Maybe an age-inappropriate horror movie or some other thing that would have connected the otherwise seemingly isolated events. Yet only a few months later, on May 20th, 2002, the site was taken down and never restored. The reason for the sudden discontinuation of the website was never disclosed, but 3 days earlier, on May 17th, an 8-year-old boy from rural Victoria disappeared from his bedroom while his parents slept. He was never seen again.
This video does not show any images until the very end, instead giving a brief account over the sound of pattering rain. These drawings correspond to the crude approximations of bizarre stickmen described in this story, accompanied with a melodramatic and bizarre song that matches the feeling of unease. Some commentators have noted the similarities between these creatures and the famous cryptid Slender Man, especially concerning their fin forms and apparent interest in stalking children. Of course, there is no concrete connection to that mythos, and we never learn whether or not the children's disappearance has anything to do with the prior events. It's likely that the story would falter were these elements added in.
Last winter, a friend and I decided to do a little urban exploration. The small town we live in shares its borders with a lot of old farmland, so we really had our pick of the litter as far as locations go. We finally settled on an old 2-story farmhouse, only a short walk to the southeast of where I live. Here's a little footage. Sorry about the audio quality. Oh yeah, so while we were in the basement of the farmhouse, I nearly tripped on something in the dark. Turns out it was a virtually new digital camera. I picked it up, turned it on, snapped a picture just to see if it still worked. Surprisingly, it's in perfect shape. I didn't notice I had video on it until I got back home. By the way, these are the recordings that were on it when I found it.
I don't know. These people feel. Feels rare. You been upstairs?
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't know really good.
You don't feel loving at all. You actually like that. Yeah, I do it for you guys. Oh my goodness, yeah.
Oh, and if you're curious, here's the picture I snapped in the basement.
Last of this set is the most involved, filming and detailing an actual exploration of an abandoned house that loosely correlates with the story. It's also the most innocuous, at least on the surface, since there are no shocking realizations or particularly strange happenings outside of the camera the narrator stumbled upon. We realize after she mentions the camera that we are actually watching the footage found on it, thus reflecting the found footage style of something like Marble Hornets. The video is largely uneventful. What does induce dread, however, is the constant low conversation you can just make out, yet don't hear any specific words, along with the final photo. The Little Fears is an evocative narrator that has influenced the fellow creepypasta narration channels, Frosted Mini Fears, and my own channel. So I'll admit that I have a soft spot for her work. I do owe a lot to her, genuinely, as these videos have set the groundwork for what I see as the essential basis of creepypasta. The point is not to circulate a shocking image or to impress people with a cool monster or to just scare people, but to spin a provocative story out of disparate materials that results in a mystery that sticks with the reader. Returning to Carroll's framework, I would argue that what makes the generalized atmosphere of The Little Fears so effective is its minimalism, representing fission on multiple fronts. Much of the accoutrement that seems essential to most creepypasta channels is actually rather extraneous, not necessarily detracting from the horror of the story itself, couching it in the comfort of the familiar. There's very little I could say about Petscop that hasn't already been explained in better depth by someone else, so I won't try to treat it like I have the other projects. If you are interested in a cohesive breakdown of Petscop's themes and story, I highly recommend that you watch the 8-part video series by Nightmare Masterclass. It's not a controversial statement to say that it is one of the best narrative web series on YouTube, so I won't embarrass myself by pretending that I'm the first to introduce anyone to it. I do think it deserves its reputation, however, and I hope that I can accomplish something half as competent and creative as Petscop someday. I'd like to be somewhat succinct with my discussion here, so I'm going to address it with 3 guiding questions. Where did it come from? Why is it psychological horror? How does it exemplify narrative horror? Petscop is a bizarre series that often feels totally unique to its kind, if not the originator of many contemporary tropes. But it's more accurate to say that Petscop just put an inventive spin on pre-existing ideas. The most well-known and widely discussed of its influences would be the phenomenon of haunted video game creepypastas, as well as the larger array of video game urban legends. The premise of one friend recording their experiences of a game for the sake of another is present in the NES Godzilla creepypasta, even in the infamous Sonic.exe. Though it's actually happened in the case of the disturbing Super Mario World ROM, Mario, or Mario. While the idea of a game slowly torturing a player as it communicates with them is most well known for Been Drowned, the thought that a game might be made with malicious purposes, albeit not by the US government, invokes hints of Polybius. The actual gameplay is reminiscent of pseudo-RPG puzzle games like Moon Remix or Tulip, which replace a dedicated battle system with bizarre minigames and errands that work on a real-time system, and their bizarre yet childlike styles express similar feelings to Petscop. Lastly, the most subtle yet consistent influences upon Petscop's larger story is Silent Hill, a fellow PlayStation 1 game that shares many of the same motifs, especially towards the latter half. Both games star inquisitive, everyman protagonists that stumble upon a set of disturbing secrets hidden beneath a veneer of tranquility. Both involve the protagonists making their way through multiple layers of a dreamscape that becomes more and more beholden to their own esoteric rules than those we're familiar with. The plot in both centers around a precocious child suffering from parental abuse that's been reborn and will be again. Both reveal that the child's abusive parent has been manipulating our protagonists in order to achieve their own inscrutable ends. Both end with the protagonist and the child interrupting a ritual orchestrated by the antagonist, while the exact fallout of their actions is left vague. There's also the fact that one of the alternate sprites for the Guardian is a red pyramid, but it's more of a tongue-in-cheek nod to the Silent Hill series than a truly meaningful connection. Another reason that Petscop resembles Silent Hill is that they both primarily exist within the subgenre of psychological horror. All horror is psychological to some extent, as it inherently plays into the gaps and fissures of our mind, but psychological horror is considered as such because it targets a very particular psyche. Everything you see and hear has a specific meaning to whoever it is meant to communicate with, even if you or the protagonist lack the means to immediately decipher it. Who was Petscop targeted at? That's a difficult question, for the answer really changes from episode to episode, and despite only utilizing one voice actor, there's a surprisingly expansive cast of characters. In truth, the most accurate answer is that Petscop is meant to antagonize a family, poking and prodding at the insecurities and secrets therein to further exacerbate the already tense circumstances. The Shining is similar in its faction, as the Overlook tortures Jack, Wendy, and Danny in their own unique ways while pitting them against one another. The horror then arises from the fusion of family drama with the specter of death and corruption, as well as the literal fusion of the stressful outer world with the escapism of a video game. I'm not going to try to unpack the plot of Petscop here and now more than I already have, especially considering how any given element of the overarching story is up to interpretation. What I aim to do instead is to unpack Carroll's structure, what he describes as the discovery plot, as it applies to Petscop's general synopsis. He names it as a discovery plot in order to emphasize how the unfolding of events follows the order of information revealed to the audience and characters, instead of the strict autonomy of the characters themselves. Loosely, this is how one charts a discovery plot. Onset, discovery, confirmation, confrontation. The onset is the first time we encounter the horror in question. There can be multiple onsets if there are multiple levels of threat, such as when Paul first reaches the Newmaker plane and when Paul discovers the grave of Michael Hammond. Discovery tends to make up the vast majority of the plot, hence the name, as it involves characters observing and investigating the anomalous entity, which one can relate to how Paul solves puzzles through trial and error or questions the tool. Confirmation involves reaffirming, or disaffirming, a character's sanity by exhibiting their discovery to another party, particularly in authority, which is best evidenced by the mysterious family that wrenches the channel for Paul. The confrontation is where one takes a discovery and applies their solutions they've concocted to the problem, which tends to result in a revelation either through underestimating or misinterpreting the nature of the problem. I took the time to cover this narrative construction here because Petscop is really the only channel with a relatively discernible, consistent plot among these, and because it is a useful tool for burgeoning storytellers. You don't have to follow it to a T, and Carroll thoroughly acknowledges that the discovery plot is modular, mixing and matching the 4 presets with new ideas, only discovery really remaining as the necessary piece. Any long-running series like Petscop, which involves multiple arcs that shift the basic dynamics of the world, will involve many multiple iterations of the discovery plot within the confines of the overarching story. Moreover, plenty of successful art projects lean into far more abstract methods of thematic conveyance, such as any number of Wham City projects, so it's important that you explore what is right for you. Returning to the central thesis of the video, I'm not attempting to dictate what you should do or aspire to as an artist. I'm mainly relating what I find most effective in the realm of internet horror. At the very least, I hope that this video has piqued your interest in any of these creators if you have not already heard of them, or has provided some novel perspective to them if you're already intimately familiar. I'm certainly a novice myself, lacking any sort of formal training or the experience necessary to fully understand my own limitations or potential. That's why I refer to these works that have influenced me, because I think that they have stood the test of time as a parameter of quality, and anything profound I might blurt out is better illustrated by these actual examples. If you enjoy horror, please consider the distinctions here between surrealism, minimalism, and the psychological, all the while understanding that there is no strict barrier between any of them. I know for a fact that there are plenty of artists just starting out with tons of untapped talent, and I savor the idea of having a hand in cultivating that.